So I'm really excited to be here. We have never, I mean, obviously we talk all the time,
Right.
but this is our first opportunity to be in conversation about your work specifically. Um, and for those of you who do not know me, my name is Layla Brown. I am, what do I want to say about myself? So we have a podcast together, Life Study Revolution. I'm also faculty here at Northeastern in Anthro, Africana Studies, and Women's Studies. And I'm also a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, GC. And Charisse and I are best friends. So here we go. All right. So today we are here to talk about your book. So I have a series of questions that I've come up with, but hopefully at some point we will open it up and allow you all, those of you who have and those of you who have not read it.
I see a large chunk that has no tabs.
Girl,
Did
no.
you skip that part?
Ma'am. Don't let me fight you. No, because the first two chapters are actually all your definitions and stuff.
Right,
So that's
exactly.
why those tabs are there.
I see.
Thank you very much.
Okay. You did the homework.
I can't stand you. Okay, so one of your primary contributions in Black Scare, Red Scare is the theorization of specific terms within the broader lexicon of Black radical praxis and repression. Those are, among others, the structural location of Blackness, U.S. capitalist racist society, and Wall Street imperialism. Can you talk us through your understanding of these phenomena and how they help us understand the particularities of radical Black repression?
Yes. So I'm not going to sort of do the specific definitions of them. They're all on page 15, by the way. All the ones that you just mentioned. But in terms of the terminology, like, we're in a battle of ideas, right? And if it is that, like, ruling class ideology obfuscates, alienates, distorts, and mystifies, and our historical task is to be as precise, illuminating, and clear as possible. And so there is a tendency in academia for people to just make shit up so they can have like a proprietary claim over knowledge. And that's not what I'm trying to do here. What I'm trying to do is really get very specifically at the dynamics understudy. So for example, structural location of Blackness was my attempt to think about, like, what is Blackness, right? So many people have heard of Afro-pessimism probably, and one of my critiques of them is that for them, they don't have a definition of Blackness, right? Blackness is anti-Blackness. And if we're talking about anti-Black racial oppression, then we have to have some understanding of what Blackness is that leads to this sort of structure of domination, right? And so Blackness is not caste, it's not simply race, it's not reducible to class, even though it has a class dynamic and an interracial class dynamic. And so structural location is a way that I describe, like, it as a relationship to the mode of production, as well as a sort of collection of discursive practices that legitimate super exploitation, expropriation, extraction, etc. And so whether or not that's the best term, I don't know, but it seems to work. If there's something better, then we'll use that. But in terms of Wall Street imperialism, this is actually a term that the folks that I profile in the book use, right? So people like Claudia Jones, Alpheus Hunton, William Patterson, Du Bois, etc. But the overarching importance of that is to put imperialism back on the table. So there's often this idea that the U.S. is not imperialist, number one. Number two, there's a lack of discussion about imperialism, right? People will talk about capitalism and all sorts of other shit, but not imperialism. But imperialism is very important, and so it was important to talk about the relationship between capitalism and imperialism, as well as racial oppression, because it's not hearts and minds and ideas, right? It's the national character of Black oppression, right? It emanates from imperialism. The other important thing about imperialism is that it has an internal logic as well as an external relationship. So there's imperial relationships within the United States. And so one that I talk about is a relationship between the U.S. North and the U.S. South, right? That part of the reason why the U.S. South is backward, right, relatively backward, so to speak, economically, is because of the unequal relationship and exploitative relationship between, like, the relatively developed North, the exogenous ownership, so the fact that the Rockefellers and the DuPonts own huge tracts of land, utilities, etc., insurance companies in the South, right? And so, to make a short story long, as I will do all night, the terminology is meant to give us a way to talk clearly about what's happening. And so, as a side note, right, one of my, like, pet peeves as analogies that are lazy, right? So right now, for example, people are talking about this as like the new McCarthyism and the McCarthyite this and the McCarthyite that. I don't share that perspective because McCarthyism is a very specific articulation. It's a very specific Red Scare that is largely driven by the legislative branch, and it has a number of different dynamics, right? And the other thing that these historical analogies can do is just allow us to speak honestly and courageously about what's happening now, right? It's easy to call somebody a Nazi as opposed to calling them, to actually describing what it is that people are actually doing, right? And then the debate becomes whether or not this or that is fascist, whether or not Netanyahu or Hamas is Nazis. Like that misses the entire point. What is actually happening materially and contemporarily. So that's the point of the sort of conceptual frameworks I try to offer in the terminology.
So I wonder if you want to say anything about U.S. capitalist racism.
Yeah. So U.S. capitalist racism. So most people have heard of like racial capitalism, right? Especially from Cedric Robinson. So I talk about capitalist racism and U.S. capitalist racist society because part of Cedric Robinson's argument is that like racialism as we know it today emanates from like the feudal order. That there's really no break between the feudal order and capitalism with respect to practices of racialization, discourses of race, etc. Again, I don't share that perspective. I think that the racial formation and the forms of racial oppression that we suffer now emanate from capitalism as such, like the capitalist mode of production, and so capitalist racism, right? That there's a particular regime of race making, especially anti-Black racial oppressions, that emanates from the capitalist world system. But I also didn't want to have to engage in the debate, these racial capitalist debates. I find them to be jejune and uninteresting. So I was like, let me just kind of do my own thing, but still be in conversation with like the extant literature. Yeah.
Okay, so in that same vein, you also offer us 3 kind of archetypes or what you call genres of radical blackness, which are the West Indian, the outside agitator, and the red-black or the black-red. So again, could you talk us through these genres and what they help us to understand about radical Black repression? But could you also take it a step further and talk about whether or not these genres hold up today? If yes, why? And if no, why not? And what might be their sort of contemporary equivalents?
So, the genres of radical blackness. Okay, so the outside agitator is basically like an educated northern Black person who comes into the South and like riles up the ignorant Blacks, right? Oftentimes it is a newspaper editor or somebody who has access to a knowledge apparatus and the ability to disseminate information nationally. And the outside agitator points out a particular contradiction, right? On the one hand, if you're educated and Black, you're dangerous because you'll be dissatisfied with your lot and therefore more likely to take up subversive ideas. But if you're Black and you're uneducated or ignorant, you're dangerous because you're susceptible to radical or foreign ideas because you don't know any better. So it's like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, right? The West Indian is an archetype that, so basically, is the confluence of like anti-foreign sentiment, of anti-Black sentiment, anti-radical sentiment, like all rolled into one. Especially in the early 20th century, there's this idea that West Indians are most dangerous because they have a class analysis, an analysis of imperialism and colonialism, as well as race. And probably race is the least important in the analysis. Compared to African Americans. Now, whether or not, this is oftentimes like rat beef, like which Black person, which Blacks are like the true like revolutionary subjects, who are the true like leaders of the diaspora. So I don't know. But, and it is true that West Indians were overrepresented in like early Communist Party formations, as well as in Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. So this was this argument that, see, they're subversive, they're trafficking in these foreign ideas, these anti-American or un-American formations, and so the West Indian is like anathema to the state. And then you have the red, black, red, which initially I had named that genre the nigger communist, because this is, number one, what the Senator Eastland called Paul Robeson. In a, like, it is on the record that he called Paul Robeson this, right? And it's also Angela Herndon, who features in the book quite heavily. in one of his trials, he was actually before the Supreme Court. The lawyer that was arguing to sort of uphold Angelo Herndon's conviction, like, called him a nigger communist and said he's trying to establish a nigger nation in the Black Belt. So, but, you know, when your book goes out for review, one of the reviewers was like, no, you can't keep saying, like, nigger in your book. And I'm like, good, but, you know. So I just say just red, black, red. But anyway, this is, like, the most anathema, like, genre, because it is somebody who is a member of the Communist Party. So it's like, to be black is already bad, but to be black and red is, like, the worst thing you can be, right? Because you believe in social equality, which for white folks is sleeping with white women, right? That's what they mean by social equality. You know, you are organizing against capitalism, right, which makes you some barbarian. You're organizing for, like, racial equality, so you don't know your place. And so this red, black, red is the worst. And then there's some sort of offshoots of that. There's, like, the fellow traveler, who is somebody who doesn't formally belong to the Communist Party, but is in some ways even worse because they're actually legitimate people who are trafficking in these communist ideas. And then the corollary to that is, like, the nigger lover. So these are, like, you know, white people. So it'd be like many of you in here who dare to organize alongside black people. Like, you're race traders. Like, you think these fucking blacks, you have them in your home. Like, you think you eschew the Jim Crow shops, like, the worst of the worst, right? And so these were the white folks who would be lynched, right, alongside black people. They would be murdered and killed and brutalized alongside their black comrades because, you know, they're race traders and therefore un-American. And as far as, so I just want to talk about one, the outside agitator, because we're already hearing this in these encampments, right? Yes. So especially at Emory, there's this argument about the outside agitators, that people are coming from wherever and coming and riling up the students who are otherwise docile and who, I guess, believe in genocide, right? Who love cops on their campuses, brutalizing them. We also heard this discourse with the Stop Cop City protests in Atlanta, and in fact, right, people are being charged with domestic terrorism, not least because it said that they cross state lines to engage in this organizing. And so what is endemic in that outside agitator discourse is anti-internationalism, it's anti-collectivism, it undermines freedom of assembly and freedom of association, and this idea, again, with respect to black folks, that, like, black people we don't have our own ideas. We don't have the ability to analyze and name our conditions. It's others from without who do that, right? And then it's the same idea about students, right? Students are just these privileged, entitled beings that only are radicalized under the influence of some nefarious force, right? An anarchist or a communist or, you know, a black revolutionary or something. So I think that is a trope that still very much is alive and well today. Like, and then a similar type of thing is, like, the woke person, right? Wokeism is just another way to say nigga. Now it's like DEI, right? Which they say means didn't earn it. DEI means didn't earn it, right? And then you have the cudgel of, like, plagiarism, right? Which conveys that these blacks who are in these high positions didn't earn these positions. So these are both witch words, like, which is a term, but it's also these are also, like, genres of like radical blackness that are dangerous and that threaten, like, the status quo.
No, I think about that a lot because yesterday one of the primary contradictions with the police on Northeastern's campus was that they wanted the students to show their IDs.
Right.
And to prove that they were there legally, right? And the vast majority of them were students, but the students were refusing that to disrupt that, right? To say if other people wanted to come and join us, they could and they should, right? But also think about how often that same critique was launched against us. So I'm from North Carolina, and I remember being fairly active with the Moral Mondays movement, Dream Defenders, and the number of times we as natives of that place got called outside agitators. I'm just thinking, and that was 10 years ago? And I also just imagine that nigger communists would not have gone over well in classrooms if people were teaching your text.
Yeah. Look at all the white people like, say it. But to be fair, like my
Delroy Lindo say, if you want to say it.
So my developmental editor is Bill Mullen, and he's white, and so he would just put NC. When he was editing, he would just say, so the NC. He's like, you're not catching me up today. So yeah, you're not dropping me. So yes.
Okay, so you've already mentioned Angela Herndon, and Marcus Garvey has also come up too. So these are two people who figure quite prominently throughout the text and are really central to the linked nature of the Black Scare and the Red Scare. Of course, you discuss them in great detail, but could you talk about how these two figures became central to the story that you wanted to tell?
Yeah, so Marcus Garvey is important because Marcus Garvey is not a communist, and in fact is deeply anti-communist, especially after 1921. He takes this this right-wing turn when he was going on a tour in the Caribbean and Central America to sell shares of the Black Star Line. And when he was gone, J. Edgar Hoover tried to prevent him from getting back into the country. And so his trip was supposed to be like 2 months. It ended up being 6 months because he couldn't get back in. He finally got back in by bribing an attorney general, basically. And so after that, he thought that he could sort of curry favor with the state by taking up like the Red Scare and trying to use the Red Scare then to like mitigate the Black Scare. But they're sutured, so it didn't work. He still got deported. He still got arrested. He still got thrown in the tombs in Atlanta. So it's like, it doesn't work. But part of the reason, but he was often red baited. In fact, so some of the earliest members of the Bureau of Black members of the Bureau of Investigation, their task was to infiltrate the African Blood Brotherhood and the UNIA. And part of what they argued is that, number one, it was full of West Indians, right? That it was those foreign blacks who were susceptible to this, but they were also saying that it is like there's Bolshevik influence in here, right? And so because Marcus Garvey advocated like self-determination and anti-Euro imperialism and was an internationalist, all of these things dovetail with communism, and so ipso facto he's a communist. And so it was important to show that, because one of the upshots is like, you don't have to be a communist. You probably should be because we're poor, but you don't have to be a communist. But you cannot be an anti-communist if you purport to care about any Black or third world liberation, because they're too closely entwined. And Marcus Garvey is an example of that. It did not work for him. A. Philip Randolph's dumbass, who I hate, but it was a similar type of thing. So he was like a left-wing anti-communist, right? So he was like, I guess, a social democrat or something, but was anti-communist, and the March on Washington movement was still accused of being infiltrated by communists. So it's like, it just doesn't save you. And then you're cutting off some of the most effective organizers, some of the best thinkers, and some of the hardest workers when you advocate anti-communism. And here, and just to say, like, anti-communism is a sort of synecdoche, right, for all these forms of radicalism, including anarchism. I guess Trotskyism is communism. I don't know what. Anyway, whatever your radicalism is, like, communism just becomes applied to anybody who's a radical. And then Angelo Herndon is important. In 1932, he was arrested in Atlanta and charged with insurrection for interracial organizing, and it was under this like old slave law that he was charged with insurrection. Now these old slave laws have gotten light recently because of the Arizona abortion ban, right? Which is based on this 1864 law. Before Arizona was even a state, they're using this 1864 law. And so anyway, like there's this, slavery is alive and well, and a lot of the legislation that was used to repress enslaved folks is repurposed antebellum, right? Or postbellum. So Angelo Herndon, essentially he is arrested and charged with insurrection for organizing an interracial march on the state house, or on the city courthouse, because 3,000 people have been thrown off the relief roll. So this is during the Great Depression. And so it was a successful uprising, even though city officials tried to like race bait and split the interracial movement, but it didn't work. They reinstated the rolls and then actually added more money. So he was arrested because he had communist literature, right? Thrown in jail, beaten, tortured, and the penalty for insurrection was the death penalty. But ultimately, when he was found guilty, he was given like Southern mercy, right? And 20 years on the chain gang, right? That was the justice, the mercy. So ultimately, this became a very important Supreme Court case. Ultimately, his case was overthrown, or it was thrown out by the Supreme Court, but only because they said the insurrection law was too vague. They didn't say that it was wrong to repress communists. They didn't say that communists have free speech. They didn't say, that this was a violation of the 14th Amendment, or the only violation of the 14th Amendment was that the law was vague. And in fact, in the opinion, what they said was that there are many anti-radical laws in other states that Georgia can adopt that aren't unconstitutional. What's interesting about the Angela Herndon case is that it is held up as this like beacon of free speech, right? This sort of testament to like the radicalism of the 1930s, which is true, right? That it's a function of the climate that Herndon was, given his right to free speech. But if you really read closely the case, it's not that, right? Only liberals would interpret it that way, basically. Which just goes to show, as the communists argue, like, the courts are capitalist courts, right? The only justice is people's justice, which is why part of what got Herndon free was organizing a mass movement. The same thing that they did for the Scottsboro case, what they would do for like Willie McGee and Rosalie Ingram and others later on. So, and Herndon is on the cover of my book. That is not Jarvis. I have this friend, Jarvis Givens, who's a professor at Harvard, and apparently people are like, Jarvis is.
It does kind of look like him, though.
Yeah, but I'm like,
it wouldn't be.
Why the fuck would Jarvis be on my book? It's like, am I shooting my shot? Like, why would I do that? That's crazy. I would put myself before Jarvis. But anyway, so this is Angela Herndon, and my mom made this cover. So, yeah.
All right, so we're going to switch gears a little bit.
Okay,
so in recent history, we've seen an uptick in the kind of hegemonic centrality of intersectionality.
She's baiting me.
As the dominant lens through which we theorize the specific realities of Black women's oppression in the U.S. and to a limited extent abroad. In Black Scare, Red Scare, you offer a robust discussion of Wall Street imperialism and the structural location of Black women. In what ways does your use of the structural location of Black women allow us to understand the central embeddedness of capitalist racism in Black women's oppression that intersectionality does not?
Yeah, so intersectionality, what we need to understand about intersectionality is that it comes about as an argument before the law, right? As a way to litigate Black women not getting raises at the Ford plant because white women were getting raises, Black men were getting raises, but Black women who are at the intersection were not, right? And so this is the basis of that court case. Because intersectionality is rooted in sort of jurisprudence, class is not a protected category before the law. It's not, right? You can be poor. You can discriminate against people because they're poor. It's legal. And so this is why in that race, class, gender trifecta of intersectionality, class is always under theorized. It's only ever really descriptive. It's not analytical, right? So it's like poor Black women, but like what is that? What is the content of that, right? Whereas structural location of Blackness, and I talk about triple oppression as the sort of enunciation of that with regard to Black women, it is about a material relationship. It is a relationship to the mode of production. It's Black women as workers, as Black, and as women. And by the way, that can be because women are there's other permutations that belong to that, right? So insofar as women might have disabilities, might have different sexual orientations, etc., that is included in there, right? It's not theorized per se, but it's capacious enough for people, for example, like the Combahee River Collective to build on that and so on and so forth. And it is objectively anti-imperialist because it is predicated on the idea that Black people are an oppressed are oppressed as a nation, which is a function of imperialism. And triple oppression is a description of that imperial relationship. So it is objectively anti-imperialist. Intersectionality is not. It can be. There are anti-imperialists who claim intersectionality, but it need not be so. And most people, in fact, who I think claim intersectionality are like maybe left liberals at best, right? And so to me, again, with respect to like language, it was really important for me to pull out that class piece, to pull out that capitalist piece, because that tends to fall by the wayside in that like race, class, gender thing. So, yeah.
She wasn't a babe.
Right. I mean, because people are like because people tend to believe like intersectional feminism is like the apotheosis of liberation, and if you are not a feminist, you're like a fucking troglodyte that like hates women, right? And that your politics are incomplete at best. And then what they'll argue is that triple oppression is a precursor to intersectionality, but they're two completely different political horizons. It's just not the case. And so, yeah, it's important. And intersectionality is fine, but I want to offer up a different analytical framework through which to understand gender and sex, right? Intersectionality is not the only thing, even though it's the hegemonic framework through which like people work.
Okay, so on page 68, you start talking about the Lust Committee report, which you can explain for people if they need to hear more about what that is. But here, I personally was struck by the lengths to which the government was going to control the revolutionary potential of so-called educated black folks. Kwame Nkrumah and others have warned of the dangers of the petty bourgeoisie intellectual and their or our propensity to betray the masses. This question isn't fully formulated, but I wanted to ask you to think through these dueling concerns of the importance of reactionary and or revolutionary potential of the so-called black intelligentsia.
Yeah, okay, so the Lust Committee report, very briefly, its title is like Revolutionary Radicalism, and the Lust Committee was a committee that was put together to study radicalism specifically in New York in 1920. It's an important report because in that post-war moment, the federal government no longer had the same powers that they had under the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act during the war. So they didn't have any peacetime anti-subversion legislation, and so those powers redounded to the state. And so New York was at the forefront, really, of it had been so. So the first anti-syndicalism and anti-anarchy statute was passed in New York in 1905. So it's significant that the Lust Committee was in New York, and that's where a critical mass of radical folks were. That's where the Rand School was, that's where the UNIA was, et cetera, et cetera. And so the Lust Committee actually like innovated a lot of the techniques that would go on to be practiced by like the Subversive Activities Control Board, House Committee on American Activities, and in fact they had like J. Edgar Hoover and others consulting, right? There was like a feedback loop between the state and federal powers. So that's what the Lust Committee report is. It's a 4-part report, very long, boring, but also interesting. It's they just get so much stuff wrong and they don't care, right? So they basically say like the Bolsheviks are like are Germans, right? They like, anyway, it's a weird connection. So anyway, in terms of the intelligentsia, right, I think it's a double-edged sword. I think that on the one hand, if it is that the intelligentsia commits class suicide, then I think it is actually a very potent force, right? Because the petty bourgeoisie has relative access, privilege, and a particular skill set that's useful for revolutionary struggle. If they do not commit class suicide, then they're enemies, class enemies. That's just the reality of the situation. And so many black educated people at that time, well, some, right, were class traitors of necessity often. Like if you're black, right, insofar as your lot as a lawyer or a newspaper editor is tied to like the worst black person, you can't escape them, then you might as well be in solidarity because, you know, what is it? A rising tide lifts all boats, so to speak, right? Then, of course, there's the other side to that, which is respectability politics, which is just like disciplining and condemning poor black people. So I think it is a double-edged sword. And this is why, you know, apropos of nothing, I've been on beating this drum too. So I feel like people misunderstand like the talented 10th, right? So people think it's just this elitist concern of Du Bois, which it is to the extent that it's this idea that development, right, or progress happens in a top-down fashion. But Du Bois was arguing that it is the responsibility of that 10%, of that talented 10th, right? That because you have the relative skill, access, and privilege, it is your responsibility to serve the race, right? And so people misconstrue it as like just this elitist thing where he's saying that the top 10% are the most important or the most talented or whatever. But what he's saying is that if it is that we're going to combat white supremacy, if we're going to be economically and politically developed, this is the group who has the obligation to do this work. And not to the detriment of everybody else, but like understanding that if you're a sharecropper, you have much less time and access to do this type of developmental work. And so this is why later on he goes on to disavow the talented 10, because he's like, you niggas ain't doing what the fuck you supposed to do. Like, you buying pianos and shit. Like, what the fuck are you doing? That is not what I said to do, you know? So, anyway, yes. So did I answer the whole question?
Yes, you did.
Okay.
Okay, so this next question is not so much something that you talk about in the book, but it's something that it came up for me as I was reading this. So you talk about the Black Belt Nation thesis as critical to the Communist Party's attempt to address the questions raised by some of its Black membership. As a Pan-Africanist, however, I can't help but see the Black Belt Nation thesis, or Russia proposing the Black Belt South as a homeland for Black folks in the U.S., as a parallel to Britain proposing Palestine to the Zionists. The Black Belt Nation thesis overlooks the self-determination of indigenous peoples of the Americas in the same way that Zionism does for Palestinians. I just wanted to hear your thoughts maybe on that reading.
Yeah, so there's like there's no settler colonialism and no like indigenous question at all in communist thought. It's one of the failures and the weaknesses, and Gerald Horne has railed against this for quite some time. It's something that the communists got wrong, alongside the fact that because there were so many European immigrants in the Communist Party, they really believed in the American project in a particular way because their conditions had been improved in the context of the United States. That's why Black people were like, actually, right? Which is why Black people are the true revolutionary subjects with respect to like critique of the United States, because it's like, that is not the experience for everybody, right? And so if we're going to talk about workers, we have to talk about the super exploited workers. We have to talk about the expropriated workers, right? So anyway, where was I going with this? Yeah, so the Black Belt Nation thesis, they certainly overlooked the indigenous question, right? And to be fair, the most effective aspect of the Black Belt Nation thesis was not necessarily this idea of taking the land per se, but it shifted the communist work to the South. And the South is still the most important front of struggle, and the one that we're always the most willing to abdicate because it's backward. The reason why it's the most important front is precisely why it is under-organized, or it's seen as just, a place that we can concede. So we'd rather boycott Florida than try to go and do the hard work of organizing, and also overlook the people who've been doing that shit, right? There's a reason why Black people and racialized people have persisted there for generations, because people are not just sitting idly by. And so that, I think, is the idea of self-determination, right? That is another important aspect of the Black Belt thesis, that Black people have the right to succeed from this country if they so choose. That, Black people, if it is that Black people see equal rights as the struggle, that is the struggle. And objectively, it is a revolutionary struggle because of the endemic racism in U.S. society. I still believe in the Black Belt thesis, but I think it's a conversation between Black and indigenous folks that needs to be had, right? There has to be a question about stewardship and what that sort of land sharing will look like. But the primary contradiction is getting the settlers out. And I don't share the perspective of some like indigenous scholars that Black people are settlers. I just don't believe that.
Although we can act like it's
let me tell you, the Blacks, the handkerchief heads have been showing their ass. There was this video, the one I sent you. So there's this video of like people getting their ass whipped by the cops at Emory, right? Yes. So there's a Black dude and a white dude. The young white dude, frumpy, whatever, he's like, you fascist fucking dogs. Then you got this Black guy in a suit. He's like, come on, y'all, we better than this. They are not better than that. That they're doing precisely what they're supposed to do. And I'm just like, come on, bro. Like, you like...
But they're still trying to appeal to this notion that, like, respectability.
Exactly. That's the petty bourgeois Negroes, and those are the people. This is why Walter Rodney said the academics are enemies of the people until proven otherwise. It's because of people like that. And it's like, you letting this young white dude show you up, like his shirt off, like he getting beat up, and he's like, fascist.
Meanwhile, both of their faces are in the ground.
Both their faces are in the ground. And he's like, whoa, come on, guys. Like reaching for his briefcase, like. It was wild. So anyway.
Yes. Okay, so switching gears again to talk a little bit about methodology. So you've previously been in conversation with Ori Burton, whose new book, Tip of the Spear.
Very good.
I can never remember this subtitle.
The Long Attica Revolt.
Yes.
And
something about Black radicalism.
Yeah.
Anyway, you two.
You should have it here, by the way. If you don't have it, it's an
really
amazing book.
And their books are actually really in conversation in a lot of interesting ways. But when you all were in conversation, you were talking about methodology. So one of the things Ori talks about is reading sources disloyally, and you talk about the practice of demystifying sources. And so I wanted you to maybe talk more about how does one know how to read a document that denies particular kinds of things, right? How do you demystify? How do you see certain things on the page, but then choose to read it in a different fashion, and then simultaneously use it to understand a specific character of Black radical repression?
You know, I'm not like, it's not like I'm Rain Man or something, but it's just like, you like, so there's like inductive and deductive, right? So I go in already with a politic, whatever. I didn't mean that to be ableist, whatever. But like, you know, you go in with a particular politic, and it alerts you to certain things. You know what I mean? And so, so I guess political education is the answer, right? Like, there's a particular way of seeing, and this is the epistemological thing, right? There's a particular way of seeing that allows you to take the sources at face value, which at face value for me is racist, capitalist, and meant to throw dirt in the eyes of the people, right? And so, and then you just have to, you have to kind of like decode these things, if you will. And it's just like, I don't believe you. I just don't believe that, right? You know what I mean? And so the problem, I think, with a lot of liberal scholars, that they believe, they give like authority to these voices. They don't have, so it's like, the suspicious eye is very important when you're like a radical scholar, because you just can't believe what these white folks say. This is why I know dinosaurs aren't real. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. It's getting hidden colors in here now. I'm kidding. But you know, like, so I think that what that means methodologically is that you tend to have to use state sources like FBI files, like these reports that I use, but you're not only looking for what's not said, but you're looking for basically flipping what is said on its head, and disaggregating like the logic of that. So like, when they're talking about Black people as, or they talk about like Black organizing as subversion. Like, what does that actually mean? Oh, that means that they're disrupting what's seen as the American way of life, right? It means that they're getting out of their place. It means that they're being disruptive. And so that reality is important to sort of to lift up, because again, otherwise, people believe this stuff. Just like, again, if we look at like the student organizing that's happening, if we believe like mainstream reports, it's like the violence that's happening. Oh, what do they mean by violence? Oh, they mean the pigs are coming in and stomping on people and beating these people to pulp. That's the violence, right? And so we just have to take what's being said and like unpack it.
Okay, so in the epilogue, you take us through a discussion of Black identity extremists as one of the continuities of the Black Scare and Red Scare. You point out that the George Floyd protests were the largest Black movement in the U.S. since Garvey, and previously the Ferguson uprisings were touted as the longest sustained civil disobedience since the Civil Rights Movement. As student protests proliferate in opposition to the ongoing genocide in Gaza, I wonder if you see resonances with the Black Scare, Red Scare, and or perhaps another prong for theorizing repression of radical politics through what's happening in Palestine.
Yeah, so what the Black Scare, Red Scare does is it shuts down, discredits, and delegitimizes organizing, right? It paints it as sort of anathema to what it means to be American, or what it means to have rights, right? That if you engage in particular types of organizing, or if you believe particular ideologies, then you basically abdicate your civil rights and civil liberties. In this moment, anti-Semitism is being used to do the work that communist and nigger lover and all these other things did in a different area. So anti-Semitism is used to, and not the real anti-Semitism of like the white supremacists, who, by the way, showed up, I think it was in New York, with a swastika at a pro-Israel rally, at a Zionist rally. So what the fuck is that? That should tell you that it seems to me that Zionism is anti-Semitic because they want to get rid of all the Jews in their society. So when Biden says something like Jews are only safe in Israel, what the fuck is he actually saying? Yeah. That's anti-Semitism, right? So I think anti-Semitism is being used to shut down like legitimate protests and legitimate rejection of genocide, right? Legitimate rejection of warmongering in a way that's disingenuous, and in a way that, again, it can just be wielded as a bludgeon. And people are just automatically supposed to shut the fuck up if you call them anti-Semitic, right? In this very cynical way. And so I think that it's using the logic of the Black Scare, Red Scare with a sort of with a different like discourse. But I think also the anti-internationalism of the Black Scare, Red Scare is what's prevalent, right? So what's dangerous right now is like this is a global uprising against, and not only is it a global uprising, it's really because of Palestine that people began to talk in a serious way about Congo, about Sudan, about Haiti. Although Black Alliance for Peace been talking about Haiti.
I mean, Black people, there is a segment of the Black that has always been talking about.
Right. But I think it brought it into the like popular imaginaries that people are like, Israel is funding like one side of the genocide that's happening in Sudan, right? Oh, Congo's not a civil war because a civil war means completely internal. This is a global capitalist war, like global capitalist induced like crisis that's ongoing because of these minerals again, and because of Israeli interests, right? That seem to be everywhere that there's conflict. There seems to be an Israeli weapon somewhere, right? And so, so there's the same sort of threats and logics. There's just a slightly different discourse. So, for just like how there was a shift from like the communists to like the extremists to the terrorists, right? That's a sort of seamless transition that we see over time. And so, but then there's still the old boogeyman, right? So you got DeSantis like K through 12 students need to learn the horrors of communism, and there's still people like, if you do anything radical, it's like, you're a communist. Or if you think Black people should not be shot by the cops, it's like, you're a communist, right? So that boogeyman is still there. And it's like, Putin is a communist. He's not. I swear to God, he's not. But okay, you know what I mean? We got to get rid of TikTok because the communists, you know, this type of thing. And so, so those, I think that the logic still pervaded, like the Black Scare, Red Scare, Long Durate creates the architecture for what then comes later, not least COINTELPRO, and then the national security state, etc.
So I have two more questions, and then I will let you all take it. So, I've been to a few places where you talked about the book, and so I know that there are some things that you were forced to leave out. So let's talk about what you had to cut from the book. So from conversations with you, I understand that several lines of thought in earlier drafts of the manuscript did not make it into the final publication. Can you talk with us about what some of those edits were and what you thought they added to the book? Also, in terms of the writing process, can you talk about how you negotiate things like that with editors and how final decisions are made?
Yeah, well, final decisions are made based on page counts and like word count, because they're like, we're not printing this big ass shit, so you gotta what are you gonna take out? You know, that's basically the moral of the story, right? And at a certain point, you just get tired of rereading it, you get tired of working on it, and it's just like you're ready to let it go. And so something that you like are white knuckle holding on to early on, by the end you're like, fuck it. So there's like three main things that I had in there that I cut out. That one was doing the whole like Cedric Robinson racial capitalism versus capitalist racism thing. I moved some of it to a footnote, and then I talked about like the South African iteration of racial capitalism and how my work is situated. And I was okay with taking that out because I have an article where I do that work. So it's called Modern U.S. Racial Capitalism: Some Theoretical Insights. The second was I had this whole section about caste. And why it's bullshit. And also, like, and so I use that as an example how when Du Bois uses caste, he uses caste a lot. He's actually talking about capitalist racism because it's a very sort of fungible and slippery signifier that he uses a lot, but he's always talking about capitalism and racism and imperialism when he uses it. So that's what he meant. But I just took that whole section and put it in an article. about Du Bois and peace activism. So, and the third thing was a very long critique of Afro-pessimism and why I use anti-Black racial oppression and not anti-Blackness, and why I don't make an ontological argument. I make a historical materialist argument, blah, blah, blah. And that was just shade. I was like, I'm not doing that. Like, I'm not giving them shine and space in my book. Like, whatever. You know, y'all, like, it's latent, like, when I use the term, like, because, you know, and they also don't have, like, a monopoly on anti-Blackness, you know? And so, yeah, so that's why I was able, someday I'm going to write a critique of Afro-pessimism. But
waiting so long.
I know, but it's also, it's like, you know, at a certain point, it's like, you know, throwing rocks at, like, toddlers. You know what I mean? I know, you know what I mean? And it's just, and there's so many good ones that it's also like, it just does not feel like a good use of my time, right? Now I have a baby, so it's probably even less likely. But, so those are the three things that I took out. And in terms of, like, the negotiating, again, so one piece of good advice Gerald Horne gave me is, like, use every part of the animal, right? And so for the vegans, I don't use every part of the flour bag or whatever, or gluten-free, I don't know, whatever, the zucchini. So I felt okay with cutting them out because I was able to, I, like, keep every single word I use. I always put somewhere because I worked hard for that, you know? So that's one thing. And again, the second thing is, like, just over time, you just get tired. Like, you just kind of, they just wear you down over time. And so you just keep, you know, you just keep the best things and the things that you feel are going to be, like, the most impactful. But it's hard, right? Especially if you're somebody who's a slow writer and, like, fights for every word. Luckily, I tend to have an overabundance and not that. But it can be hard to, like, let go of things that you really care about. So.
Okay, so finally, we do not get to determine how our works are received once we let them out in the world. But I think, if I know you, so I think I know that it is important to you that this book not only have legs among academics. So how do you imagine your work, which explores a particular far-off epic, will be received, or is received in the moment, by an audience outside of formal institutions like the university? And in what ways might your work be useful for helping us, you've already talked about this a bit, but helping us understand Israel as an extension of U.S. imperialism and some present iteration of the Black Scare, Red Scare?
Yeah, so I actually I don't really imagine that. Like, I don't really think about my book that much. But I have talked to people who, like, have used it in PE, right? And so I think that one of the reading groups or, like, study groups used it to sort of, again, to basically understand, like, this current moment. I think that people find the terminology useful. I think maybe in the writing clear. Some of it is, you know, some people think it's, like, too academic or whatever, which is perfectly fine. But then I can come and explain things in the groups when they invite me to come. But I think, I guess I wanted it to resonate outside of academia, just because we can be quite myopic in our organizing, like, have no historical arc, you know, constantly reinvent the wheel, constantly think that, like, we are not only the most brilliant, but also the most oppressed and repressed generation to ever live. And also, when we think about radicalism, our only historical reference point is the 60s. Shit happened before that and after that, right? And so I think that those are the things I wanted to resonate. And also, again, the point that I made earlier, that, like, you cannot be an anti-communist and be for liberation. It just is impossible. You can be a liberal, you can be a progressive, right? But you cannot be a revolutionary and be an anti-communist. Fascists are anti-communist and have been so, and that they were anti-communist first before the other stuff, right? They were the first people to get thrown in jail, right? And the trade unionists. So those are things that I hope resonate with people outside. And also, like, the race or class debate is not real. It's a race and class, right? And so for our friends on the left, our white friends on the left, as Gerald Horne would call them, you know, like, it's not just it's not identity reductionism to say that settler colonialism matters, to say that, like, anti-Black racial oppression matters, at the same time that we need to point out race hustling and not be race reductionist. But, like, they both matter. And to, like, our Black friends, like, you're poor and Black. That matters, right? And, like, Beyonce and them have nothing to do with your reality, right? Black capitalism, not a thing. and also not going to save us. And so like those are some of the things that I hope that people get in terms of their organizing, whether they're doing like hyper local things or have a more internationalist orientation. Yeah. So that's that. That's Black Scare, Red Scare.